The staples in my side pulled when I sat up, but I didn't care because Tasha was standing in my doorway holding something that wasn't flowers. 3 weeks since the surgery and my apartment still smelled like antiseptic and old gauze, the kind of smell that sticks to your throat when you breathe. She looked good, though, better than she had in months. Her skin clear and her eyes bright in a way that made the pain in my abdomen feel like it meant something. I was 25 years old and I'd given her my kidney because that's what you do when you love someone, when you've been together for 7 years and you know her laugh better than your own heartbeat. She crossed the room slowly, her heels clicking on the hardwood I'd refinished myself back when we thought we'd grow old here together, and she placed a manila envelope on the coffee table between us like she was serving legal papers. But before we continue, please subscribe, like and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more great stories. The envelope sat there fat and official with my name typed across the front in letters that looked too formal for anything good. I remember thinking it was paperwork from the hospital, maybe insurance documents or donor registry forms, the kind of bureaucratic aftermath that follows any major medical procedure. But Tasha didn't sit down next to me like she usually didn't kiss my forehead or ask how I was feeling or check the incision site the way she had every single day before this one. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, her leather jacket still on like she wasn't planning to stay, and there was something in her posture that made my stomach drop faster than any anesthesia ever could. Outside, a car alarm went off 3 blocks away, and the sound carried through my open window along with the smell of someone grilling. Normal Thursday afternoon sounds that suddenly felt very far away from whatever was happening in my living room. I reached for the envelope with my left hand because my right side was still weak, the muscles there not quite remembering how to work properly after the surgeons had carved through them to take what was mine and put it inside her. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind lawyers use when they want you to know this isn't casual correspondence. I pulled out the document, and the first words I saw were printed in bold at the top of the page: non-disclosure and waiver of emotional claims. My eyes scanned down through whereas clauses and party of the first part language, legal terminology that basically said I couldn't talk about the surgery, couldn't discuss our relationship, couldn't make any claims about agreements made under emotional duress or physical vulnerability. It was the kind of document you sign when you're being silenced, when someone wants to make sure you can never use your story against them. I looked up at Tasha, and she was checking her phone. Her nails painted the deep burgundy color I'd always loved, but which now just looked like dried blood in the afternoon light. She'd gained weight since the transplant. Healthy weight that filled out her face and made her look like herself again instead of the hollow-eyed woman who'd cried in my arms when the diagnosis came back. I'd held her through those nights, driven her to every appointment, researched dietary restrictions and medication schedules and donor compatibility until I knew more about kidney function than most medical students. And I'd made the choice to give her mine without hesitation, without conditions, because when someone you love is dying, you don't think about paperwork or protection or what might happen after. You just think about keeping them alive. "What is this?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, probably from the pain medication I'd taken an hour ago mixing with the confusion that was starting to taste like metal in my mouth. Tasha finally looked at me, really looked at me, and for just a second I saw something in her eyes that might have been guilt or might have been something worse. She uncrossed her arms and sat down on the arm of the couch, not next to me but close enough that I could smell her perfume. The expensive kind she'd started wearing recently, even though she'd been on disability and shouldn't have had money for luxuries. She reached out like she might touch my hand but stopped halfway, her fingers hovering in the air between us like she couldn't decide whether comfort was still something she was allowed to offer. "It's just a formality," she said, and her voice had that careful tone people use when they're lying but want it to sound like truth, that studied casualness that lawyers probably teach in continuing education seminars. She glanced toward the window like she was checking for something or someone, and that small gesture made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with surgical recovery. I'd known Tasha for 7 years, and I'd never seen her look guilty about anything, not when she'd wrecked my car or forgotten my birthday or stayed out until dawn with her girlfriends. But right now, she looked like someone who'd done something they couldn't take back and was trying to figure out if they'd gotten away with it. "Who wrote this?" I asked, flipping through the pages and seeing signature lines and witness requirements and clauses about financial liability and emotional damages that made no sense for a kidney donation between two people in love. My hands started shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from the medication wearing off or from the realization that something was very wrong here, that the woman I'd literally given part of my body to was standing in my apartment with a document designed to shut me up. Tasha stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to me now, her shoulders tight under the leather jacket that I suddenly realized I'd never seen before today. She was quiet for so long that I almost repeated the question, almost demanded an answer, but some instinct told me to wait, to let the silence stretch until it forced her to fill it. "Richard said it's for your own protection," she finally said, and she didn't turn around when she said it. Didn't watch my face to see how I'd react to hearing my boss's name come out of her mouth in my living room 3 weeks after major surgery. Richard, who ran the auto shop where I'd worked for 3 years. Richard, who'd always been a little too friendly with Tasha when she'd stop by. Richard, who'd given me time off for the donation, but who I'd never told about the personal details, never mentioned by name in any conversation with her that I could remember. The car alarm outside finally stopped, and in the sudden quiet I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the sound of Tasha's heel tapping against my floor like she was counting down seconds until she could leave. I read the document 3 more times after Tasha left, each pass revealing new ways I was being backed into a corner by language I barely understood. The clauses covered everything from public statements to private conversations, from social media posts to discussions with family members, basically ensuring that my kidney donation would be erased from any narrative Tasha chose to tell. There was even a section about gifts given under emotional manipulation that made it sound like I'd somehow pressured her into accepting my organ, like I was the one who'd done something wrong here. My side ached where the surgeons had gone in, and I thought about how that scar would be with me forever while she got to walk away clean, her new kidney functioning perfectly inside her body while she pretended we'd never been anything more than acquaintances who'd signed some papers. The worst part was the financial clause buried on page 4, the one that said if I violated any terms of the agreement I'd be liable for damages up to $200,000. $200,000 I didn't have, would never have working as a mechanic even if I put in 80-hour weeks for the next decade. It was the kind of number designed to terrify you into compliance, to make sure you understood that speaking your truth would cost you everything. I set the document down and picked up my phone, pulled up Tasha's number and then stopped because what was I going to say to her that wouldn't just prove I was exactly as naive as whoever wrote this document clearly thought I was. Instead, I called my cousin Jerome, who'd gone to law school before dropping out to sell insurance, figuring he'd at least know if this thing was even legal. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear his kids screaming in the background. Normal family chaos that made my empty apartment feel even more hollow. I told him what happened, reading sections of the document out loud while he went quiet in that way that meant he was either thinking hard or trying to figure out how to tell me something I didn't want to hear. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "D, who's the attorney listed on this?" And I looked and saw a name I didn't recognize from a firm in downtown Detroit, the expensive part of downtown where people don't fix their own cars. Jerome told me not to sign anything, told me to scan the document and send it to him so he could show it to someone who actually finished law school, someone who'd know if this was intimidation or actual legal standing. But he also said something else, something that stuck with me after we hung up. Man, people don't write documents like this unless they're hiding something big, something they think you might figure out if you talk. I sat there in my living room as the sun went down and the streetlights came on outside, thinking about what Tasha could possibly need to hide when I was the one who'd saved her life, when I was the one lying here with staples in my side and pain shooting through my abdomen every time I breathed wrong. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what I'd been avoiding since she left. I went into my closet and pulled out the old tablet Tasha used to use before she upgraded to a new one last year. She'd left it here because the screen was cracked and it was slow and she'd said she didn't need it anymore, told me to donate it or trash it or whatever. I'd kept it because I kept everything, because I was the kind of person who held on to concert tickets and birthday cards and broken electronics that might still have some use. I plugged it in and waited for it to boot up, the screen flickering to life with her old wallpaper still there, a photo of us from 2 summers ago at Belle Isle looking happy in a way that now seemed like evidence from a crime scene. Her email was still logged in, messages from a year ago still sitting in the inbox unread and unimportant. I knew I was crossing a line looking through her private correspondence, knew that healthy relationships don't involve snooping through old devices like some jealous teenager, but healthy relationships also don't involve legal documents designed to silence kidney donors. So I scrolled back through her sent folder looking for anything that might explain why Richard's name had come out of her mouth in my apartment. Most of it was boring. Confirmation emails and spam and conversations with her sister about nothing important. But then I found the drafts folder and saw an unsent message from 3 weeks ago, the day after my surgery when I was still in the hospital barely conscious. The email was addressed to someone named Rich, no last name, but I didn't need one to know who she meant, and the subject line was blank like she'd been writing in a hurry or in secret. The message itself was short, only 2 lines that I read so many times they burned themselves into my memory. I'll make sure he signs. You promised me Miami. Below, that was a blank space where she'd probably been planning to write more before she either lost courage or decided the message was too dangerous to send even in draft form. Miami was where Richard had a vacation property. I knew because he'd mentioned it constantly at work, always talking about his condo on South Beach like it was proof he'd made something of himself beyond a chain of auto shops in southeastern Michigan. I sat on my bedroom floor with the tablet in my hands and felt something cold settle in my chest. Something that wasn't quite understanding yet, but was close enough to hurt. Tasha had never mentioned Miami to me, had never talked about trips or vacations or anything beyond her recovery and getting back to normal life. But here was evidence that she'd been planning something with Richard, my boss Richard, who'd sent her into my apartment with a document designed to keep me quiet. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I could see the shape they were making. Could feel the outline of something ugly taking form in the space between what I'd believed and what was actually true. I took screenshots of the draft email and sent them to myself, covered my tracks by deleting the sent message from her tablet and clearing the recently used apps. Then I plugged the tablet back in where I'd found it and went back to my living room, pacing despite the pain in my side because sitting still felt impossible now. Outside my window, Detroit was settling into night. Cars passing on the street below, and somewhere a dog barking and everything continuing on like the world hadn't just shifted under my feet. I thought about Richard at work with his expensive watches and his white teeth, and the way he'd always found reasons to talk to Tasha when she came by. How I'd noticed but never worried because I'd trusted her, trusted that what we had was solid enough to survive a little harmless flirting from my boss. But this wasn't harmless, and it wasn't flirting. And somewhere in the back of my mind I was starting to understand that I hadn't saved Tasha's life at all. I just made myself useful enough that someone could use me for parts and then throw away what was left. The thought made me angry in a way I hadn't felt since I was younger and stupider, and thought anger solved anything. But I wasn't young anymore, and I wasn't stupid, and this time I wasn't going to let rage make me careless. This time I was going to be smart about it, patient about it, because whatever was happening here involved my boss and legal documents and plans for Miami, and you don't fight that kind of thing with your fists. You fight it by being smarter than they think you are, by staying quiet until you understand exactly what game they're playing, and then you win. Monday morning, I showed up to work at the shop like nothing had changed, like I hadn't spent the weekend digging through evidence of my girlfriend conspiring with my boss. The mechanics were already there when I arrived. Dante and Big Marcus and young Tommy, who was still in his apprenticeship and looked up to me like I knew something worth learning. They all asked how I was feeling, and I told them better, good enough to do light work and catch up on paperwork, which was true enough that they didn't question it. Richard's office door was closed when I walked past it, and I could see him through the window on the phone, his feet up on his desk and his expression relaxed in that way people look when they think they're untouchable. I'd worked for Richard for 3 years, and in that time I'd never really thought about him as anything other than the boss, the guy who signed my checks and occasionally showed up in the bays to pretend he still knew how to turn a wrench. He was 42 and divorced and wore polo shirts with the shop logo embroidered on the chest, the kind of man who'd built a small business into a decent living and thought that made him important. His shops did well because he was smart about locations and pricing, set up in neighborhoods where people needed affordable repairs and didn't ask too many questions about where parts came from. I'd always figured his success was legitimate, if not exactly impressive, the result of hard work and good timing rather than anything exceptional. But now I was looking at him through the window and seeing him differently, seeing the way he checked his phone every few minutes and smiled at whatever he was reading, seeing the expensive watch on his wrist that I knew cost more than I made in 3 months. He'd been at the shop the day I told everyone about the donation, had even pulled me aside after to tell me I was doing a noble thing and that the company would support me however they could. I remembered thinking it was decent of him, thinking maybe he wasn't such a bad guy after all, despite his ego and his obvious pleasure at being the man in charge. Now I wondered if that conversation had given him ideas, if he'd seen opportunity in my sacrifice the way certain people always see opportunity in other people's weakness. Tasha had started coming by the shop more often about 6 months ago, around the time her symptoms got bad, but before we knew what was causing them. She'd wait for me to finish my shift and we'd grab dinner, or she'd ride home with me. Normal couple stuff that I hadn't thought twice about. But now I was remembering how Richard always found excuses to come out of his office when she was there, how he'd lean against whatever car I was working on and make small talk about nothing while his eyes tracked her movements across the shop floor. I chalked it up to him being a man who noticed attractive women, harmless appreciation that didn't mean anything because Tasha was mine and everyone knew it. Except maybe it had meant something. Maybe those conversations I'd half listened to while I was elbow deep in an engine had been the beginning of whatever this was. Maybe while I was focused on gaskets and timing belts, Richard was focused on something else entirely, seeing an angle I was too trusting or too stupid to notice. The thought made my hands shake as I sorted through invoices at my workstation, made me grip the papers harder than necessary until Big Marcus looked over and asked if I was all right. I told him, yeah, just tired from the recovery, which was easier than explaining that I was starting to realize I'd been played by people I thought I could trust. At lunch, Richard came out of his office and told everyone he was buying pizza to celebrate me being back. Said something about the shop not being the same without its best mechanic. The guys cheered and I smiled because that's what you do when your boss is being generous. You smile and say thanks and pretend you don't notice the way his eyes linger on you just a second too long. When the pizza arrived, Richard made a point of handing me the first slice, clapping me on the shoulder in that way bosses do when they want to seem like one of the guys. His hand was heavy on my shoulder, and I felt the staples pull under my shirt, felt the reminder of what I'd given up while he stood there acting like my friend. "You're tougher than you look," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been admiration or might have been something else, something that sounded like he was testing me to see if I'd break. I met his eyes and kept my face neutral, kept everything I was thinking locked down behind the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. He held my gaze for just a moment, and then he laughed, squeezed my shoulder once more, and walked away, back to his office where I'm sure he had more important things to do than worry about whether his mechanic suspected anything. But I did suspect. More than suspect, actually. I was starting to piece together a picture that I didn't like at all. That night after my shift, I sat in my car in the parking lot and watched Richard lock up, watched him check his phone and smile at whatever message he'd just received. He got into his BMW, the black one he'd bought last year and bragged about for weeks, and I watched him drive away toward downtown instead of toward his house in the suburbs. I knew where his house was because he'd had me come out once to look at his wife's minivan back before the divorce, back when he still pretended he had a normal family life. I didn't follow him because I wasn't ready for that yet, wasn't ready to commit to the kind of surveillance that would make this whole thing real and irreversible. Instead, I went home and pulled out the tablet again, went through Tasha's old emails more carefully this time, looking for patterns and connections I'd missed the first time. What I found was a thread of deleted messages from 8 months ago, conversations between her and someone saved in her contacts as just R, where they talked about opportunities and timing and being patient. The messages were vague enough to be innocent if you wanted to believe they were innocent, But I didn't want to believe that anymore. I wanted to know what was really happening, what I'd walked into when I agreed to give her my kidney, and I was starting to think that the only way to find out was to stop trusting what people told me and start paying attention to what they did when they thought no one was watching. Tuesday morning, I pulled up to the shop and knew something was wrong before I even got out of my car. The usual crowd of vehicles waiting for service wasn't there, just Dante's truck and one other car I didn't recognize parked in the customer lot. The bay doors were closed, even though we always opened them by 7, and when I walked to the front entrance I found it locked with a sign taped to the inside that said, "Closed for inventory. Employees report to office." I'd worked here 3 years, and we'd never closed for inventory on a Tuesday. Never closed at all unless it was a holiday or the power was out. I used my key to get in through the side door and found Dante and Marcus standing in the break room looking uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable people get when they know something bad is coming and they're trying to figure out if they're part of it. Tommy wasn't there yet, and when I asked where everyone else was, Marcus just shook his head and told me Richard wanted to see me in his office. The walk down that hallway felt longer than it should have, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor while my mind ran through possibilities, none of them good. Through the window I could see Richard sitting behind his desk with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them looking at a laptop screen with expressions that were all business. Richard looked up when I knocked and told me to come in, his voice carrying none of the false friendliness from yesterday's pizza lunch. The woman turned out to be from HR, which I didn't even know we had since we were a small operation that usually handled employment issues with a handshake and a conversation. She introduced herself as Patricia something and told me to sit down, then launched into a speech about the company taking allegations seriously and needing to protect its assets and reputation. I sat there trying to follow what she was saying while Richard watched me with an expression I couldn't read, something between sympathy and satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "We've discovered some irregularities in our parts inventory," Patricia said, pulling out a folder thick with printed pages, each one showing invoices and orders that apparently had my signature on them. She spread them across the desk and I recognized my handwriting on maybe half of them, legitimate orders I'd placed for repairs we'd actually done. But the other half were new to me. Invoices for expensive parts ordered from suppliers I'd never heard of, parts that according to these documents had been signed out under my employee number and never returned or installed on any vehicle in our system. The numbers added up to tens of thousands of dollars in missing inventory, maybe more, and every single fraudulent order had my name attached to it. "I didn't order these," I said, picking up one of the invoices and seeing my signature at the bottom, even though I had no memory of ever touching this particular piece of paper. It was a good forgery, close enough to my actual handwriting that I couldn't prove it wasn't mine without a forensics expert, and I didn't have money for forensics experts. Patricia nodded like she'd expected me to deny it, pulled out another document that showed my employee access logs, times I'd supposedly been in the parts room or using the ordering system when I knew for a fact I'd been home or at the hospital or anywhere else. The evidence was comprehensive and damning and completely fabricated, but it was also official-looking enough that arguing felt pointless. Richard finally spoke up, his voice careful and measured like he'd practiced this conversation in a mirror. "Look, Derek, I want to believe you. You're one of my best guys, but I've got suppliers calling me about unpaid invoices. I've got an audit coming up, and all the evidence points to you." He paused like he was genuinely troubled by this, like it pained him to have to question my integrity. "We're going to have to suspend you pending a full investigation. Paid suspension," he added quickly, like that made it better, like getting to sit at home while my reputation collapsed was some kind of gift. I stood up because sitting felt like accepting this, like agreeing I deserved to be treated like a criminal in a place where I'd worked honestly for 3 years. "This is a setup," I said, and both of them looked at me with expressions that were probably supposed to be understanding, but really just looked like pity. Patricia started talking about due process and company policy, and how I'd have a chance to present my side of things once the investigation was complete. But I barely heard her, because I was watching Richard and seeing something flicker in his eyes that looked like triumph. He wanted me to blow up, Wanted me to make a scene so he could add insubordination to whatever other charges he was building. So I didn't blow up. I nodded slowly and told them I understood. Told them I'd cooperate fully with their investigation because I had nothing to hide. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth, but I said it anyway. Watched Richard's face fall just slightly when I didn't give him the explosion he'd been hoping for. Patricia handed me a letter that outlined the terms of my suspension, told me to leave my keys and my access badge on the desk, and that they'd be in touch. I did what she asked, moving slowly and deliberately like I had all the time in the world, like this wasn't destroying me from the inside out. Walking out through the shop, I saw Dante and Marcus watching from the break room, their faces full of questions they weren't going to ask where anyone could hear them. I gave them a nod and kept walking, pushed through the side door into the parking lot where the morning sun was bright and indifferent. My car was where I'd left it, and I got in and sat there for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel and my mind racing through everything that had just happened. I'd been framed, professionally and thoroughly, by people who knew exactly how to make it look legitimate, and the timing was perfect, coming right after I'd refused to sign Tasha's document, right after I'd started asking questions that apparently someone didn't want answered. I pulled out my phone and called Jerome again, told him what happened while I watched Richard through the office window, still sitting there with Patricia like they were discussing the weather instead of destroying someone's livelihood. Jerome swore softly and told me to document everything, to write down exactly what was said and who was there and what evidence they'd shown me. He said it sounded like retaliation, like Richard was punishing me for not signing that non-disclosure, but proving it would be hard without more than my word against official company documents. We talked for another few minutes, and then I hung up and just sat there, parked outside the shop where I'd spent 3 years building a reputation that was now worth nothing. That's when I remembered the cameras. Richard had installed security cameras 6 months ago after someone broke into the bay and stole tools, cameras that covered every entrance in the parts room and even the parking lot. The feeds went to a server in his office, but there was also remote access through an app that all the supervisors had, an app I'd been given access to last year when I'd been acting as shift lead. I pulled up the app on my phone expecting my access to be revoked already, but apparently HR moved slower than Richard's ambition because the login still worked. And what I saw in the saved footage from last night made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. The camera footage was time-stamped at 2:17 in the morning, long after the shop had closed and everyone had gone home. The parking lot was empty except for Richard's BMW and another car I recognized immediately as Tasha's silver Honda, the one I'd helped her pick out 2 years ago when her old car died. They were parked near the back entrance where the lighting was worst, where the camera had to work harder to capture anything clearly. I watched as Richard unlocked the bay door and both of them went inside, moving quickly like they knew exactly where they were going, and didn't want to spend any more time on camera than necessary. I fast-forwarded through 20 minutes of nothing, just an empty parking lot and closed doors until they emerged again carrying boxes. Not small boxes either, the heavy-duty plastic storage containers we used for organizing expensive parts, the kind that could hold alternators or catalytic converters or any of the high-value inventory that shops like ours kept locked up. Richard carried 2 boxes to his BMW, while Tasha followed with a third, both of them working with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this before. They made 3 trips total, loading maybe 9 or 10 boxes into both vehicles, and I watched the whole thing with a sick feeling spreading through my chest. I saved the footage to my phone and kept scrubbing through the previous weeks, looking for other instances of late-night activity. What I found was a pattern going back almost 4 months, always Richard and Tasha. Always the same routine of loading boxes and driving away. The dates corresponded roughly to when Tasha's medical bills would have been piling up, when she was too sick to work but still needed expensive treatments and medications. I thought about those bills, about how she'd always been vague about how she was paying for everything, telling me her insurance was covering most of it and not to worry. I'd been too focused on her recovery and my own upcoming surgery to press for details, too trusting to imagine she might be funding her health care through theft. The last video I watched was from the night before my suspension. The night before Richard's HR person showed up with forged invoices. In this footage, they were more careless, taking longer to load the boxes, and at one point Richard left his phone on the hood of his car with the screen facing up. The camera caught it for maybe 3 seconds before he grabbed it again, but 3 seconds was enough for me to zoom in and see what was on his screen. It was a text conversation with me. My name at the top of Richard's phone. The most recent message on screen was from Richard. "Everything's in place. He'll be gone by Friday." I took screenshots of everything, the vehicles, the boxes, the phone screen, all of it saved to my cloud storage and emailed to Jerome and to myself at 2 different addresses just to be safe. Then I went back and looked at one specific frame I'd almost missed the first time through, a moment when Richard had set down one of the boxes to adjust his grip. The box was turned just enough that the camera caught the label on the side, a white sticker with black text that our inventory system printed automatically whenever items were checked out. The sticker showed an employee ID number, the date, and the part description, all of it in the format I'd seen 1,000 times on legitimate paperwork. The employee ID number was mine. My 8-digit identifier that was supposed to be secure, that was supposed to only work when I personally logged into the system with my password. Except clearly, it wasn't secure at all. Clearly, someone with admin access could use my number to check out inventory I'd never touched, could create a paper trail that led directly to me while they walked out with thousands of dollars in stolen parts. I zoomed in as far as the footage would allow and took screenshots of the label, of the proof that someone had systematically used my identity to cover their theft. I sat in my car outside the shop for another hour, going through footage and taking notes and trying to think 3 steps ahead of whatever game Richard and Tasha were playing. The parts they were stealing weren't random, I realized as I cross-referenced the invoices Patricia had shown me with what I could see in the videos. They were all items tied to a federal recall, catalytic converters and airbag modules and fuel pumps that were supposed to be sent back to manufacturers for safety investigations. Those parts were valuable because repair shops got reimbursed for them, but they were even more valuable on the black market where someone could sell them to shady operations that didn't care about recalls or safety. Richard would have known which parts were valuable, would have had access to the recall notices and the reimbursement schedules, and he would have known that if the theft was ever discovered, having a patsy already set up would protect him from any real consequences. I was that patsy, the trusted mechanic with access to the parts room and the ordering system, the guy who'd just donated a kidney and might be seen as desperate enough or distracted enough to steal. The story practically wrote itself. Sympathetic employee facing medical debt makes bad choices, boss discovers theft, employee gets fired, clean and simple and completely believable. Except they'd made one mistake. The kind of mistake that people make when they're arrogant and they've gotten away with something for so long that they stop being careful. They'd forgotten about the cameras, or maybe they thought Richard's admin access meant he could just delete footage whenever he wanted. But the security system backed up to the cloud automatically, and while Richard could delete local files, the cloud backups required a different level of access that apparently he didn't have. So every theft was preserved, every late-night visit documented, every box labeled with my ID number but carried by someone else's hands. I started my car and drove home slowly, my mind already working through what came next. I couldn't go to the police yet because Richard would just claim I was trying to cover my own theft, would point to all the forged paperwork and say I was desperate to blame someone else. I couldn't go to the other mechanics because even if they believed me, they'd lose their jobs for supporting a suspended employee, and most of them had families that depended on that paycheck. I couldn't even confront Tasha because she'd just deny everything and run to Richard, and then they'd know I had evidence before I was ready to use it. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went home and started building a case. I organized the footage by date, created a timeline of thefts, matched stolen parts to recall notices, and calculated the total value of what had been taken. The number came to over $80,000, enough to charge Richard with felony theft and probably land him in prison if I could prove it. The evidence was good, but it wasn't quite enough yet, because a decent lawyer could argue that I'd had access to the cameras too, could have doctored the footage or selectively saved clips that made me look innocent. I needed more, something that tied Richard and Tasha together in a way that showed clear intent and conspiracy. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a local area code but not one I recognized. I almost didn't open it, thinking it was spam or a wrong number, but something made me click on the message. What I saw made my hands go numb and my vision tunnel until all I could see were the words on my screen. You should have kept your kidney. Now you'll lose everything else. Below the text was a photo, grainy but clear enough to make out what it was showing. It was me unconscious in a hospital bed, tubes coming out of my arm and monitors beeping around me. Someone had taken this picture while I was in surgery, while I was under anesthesia giving away part of myself to save someone who was planning to destroy me. And they'd kept it this whole time, waiting for the right moment to let me know just how completely I'd been played. The letter from HR arrived 2 days later, delivered by certified mail, so I had to sign for it like it was something official and final. Inside was a formal notice of termination citing gross misconduct, theft of company property, and violation of my employment agreement. The language was careful and legal, full of phrases like preponderance of evidence and failure to provide satisfactory explanation that made it clear this wasn't a suspension anymore. This was the end. At the bottom was a notice that the company would be filing a claim with the police for grand theft, that they'd be pursuing civil damages for the full value of the missing inventory, and that my final paycheck would be withheld pending resolution of these matters. I read it 3 times standing in my doorway while the mail carrier drove away, each pass making me angrier and more focused than I'd been since this whole thing started. My phone had been buzzing constantly since word got out about my termination, friends and former coworkers reaching out with questions I couldn't answer without explaining everything. I ignored most of them except for Dante, who called that afternoon and spoke carefully like he thought the line might be tapped. He told me the mood at the shop was strange, that Richard had hired 2 new mechanics already and was acting like nothing had happened, like I'd never existed at all. Tommy had asked questions about the accusations, and Richard had shut him down hard, told everyone that the matter was being handled by authorities and that discussing it would be grounds for termination. The message was clear. Stay quiet or lose your job too. I spent that week living off savings and watching my bank account shrink, calculating how long I could last before I'd have to move back in with my mother or start selling things I couldn't afford to lose. The medical bills from the donation were starting to arrive too, insurance covering most of it, but leaving me with co-pays and deductibles that added up to thousands I didn't have. Every envelope that showed up felt like another nail in a coffin someone else was building, another piece of evidence that I'd been set up to fail in every possible way. Some nights I'd lie awake and think about that kidney inside Tasha, keeping her alive while she helped destroy me, and the irony was so bitter I could taste it. Jerome came by on Friday with a friend from the prosecutor's office, a woman named Lisa Chen, who listened to my story with the kind of skeptical attention lawyers give to people they think might be lying. I showed her everything, the videos, the timeline, the screenshots of Tasha's emails, all of it laid out on my laptop while she took notes and asked questions that felt designed to poke holes in my version of events. When I finished, she sat back and told me what I already suspected, that while the evidence was suggestive, it wasn't conclusive, that a good defense attorney would tear apart the chain of custody on the videos and argue that I'd manipulated the footage to frame my boss after getting caught stealing. "You need something that shows intent," Lisa said, tapping her pen against her notepad in a way that suggested she was thinking through angles I hadn't considered. "Right now, this looks like he said she said with some security footage that could be interpreted multiple ways. What you need is communication between them that explicitly discusses the frame-up, something that shows this was planned." I told her about the draft email on Tasha's tablet, about Miami and the promises Richard had made, but she shook her head before I even finished. Draft emails weren't admissible without proving they were actually sent, and even then they were too vague to demonstrate criminal conspiracy. She needed something concrete, something recent, something that tied the theft directly to the plan to blame me. After they left, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what would happen if I couldn't prove any of this. Richard would walk away clean, probably sell the stolen parts for cash and use the money to fund more of whatever lifestyle he was building. Tasha would go to Miami or wherever else he'd promised her, healthy and happy with my kidney keeping her alive while I faced criminal charges. The injustice of it was overwhelming, the kind of thing that made you want to break furniture or scream until your voice gave out. But I'd learned a long time ago that anger without strategy was just noise. Instead, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I started following Richard. Not obviously, not in a way he'd notice, but carefully and from a distance the way you track something dangerous that might bite if it sees you coming. I knew his schedule from 3 years of working for him, knew he left the shop around 6 most days and headed either home or to the bar on Jefferson where he liked to pretend he was friends with the owner. I waited in my car down the block from the shop that evening, baseball cap pulled low and my phone in my lap recording everything just in case something happened worth documenting. Richard left at 6:15, his BMW pulling out of the lot and heading east toward downtown instead of west toward his house. I followed at a distance, staying 2 or 3 cars back and trying to remember everything I'd ever seen in movies about surveillance, about not being obvious and not getting too close. He drove for 20 minutes before pulling into the parking structure of a luxury apartment building on the riverfront, one of those new developments that charged $4,000 a month for a studio with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who pretended to care about your day. I couldn't follow him inside without being noticed, so I parked across the street and watched the entrance, wondering who he was visiting and whether it had anything to do with me. 40 minutes later, he came out with Tasha beside him, both of them laughing about something like they were on a date, like they were 2 people who'd just shared a meal or maybe something more. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something expensive-looking that fit her in ways that suggested she'd been shopping with money that hadn't come from disability checks. They stood by his car for a minute, close enough that I could see him touch her arm, could see her smile up at him in a way she used to smile at me before everything went wrong. Then they got in his car and drove off together, heading toward the freeway that would take them out of the city if they were going somewhere far enough to matter. I followed them for an hour, staying back far enough that they couldn't possibly notice me in the evening traffic. They ended up at a storage facility in Taylor, one of those places with rows of identical orange doors and security codes that keep honest people out but don't do much to stop anyone with real intent. Richard had a code, and I watched them pull up to a unit near the back, watched them open it and start carrying boxes out, the same boxes I'd seen them loading in the security footage. They worked for 20 minutes, transferring everything to a white cargo van that was parked inside the unit, a vehicle I'd never seen before and that wasn't registered to the shop. I took photos of everything with my phone, the license plate on the van, the storage unit number, Richard and Tasha working together like this was routine and normal. At one point, they stepped outside to smoke and I zoomed in as far as my camera would allow, caught them in profile having what looked like a serious conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could read their body language, could see tension in the way Tasha crossed her arms and the way Richard gestured while he talked, pointing back at the van like he was explaining something she didn't want to hear. After a few minutes, she nodded and they went back inside, finished loading the van, and then locked the storage unit behind them. They drove back separately, Richard in his BMW and Tasha in the van, and I made a choice in that moment that would either save me or finish what they'd started. Instead of following them, I stayed at the storage facility, waited until they were gone and the evening had settled into full dark. Then I walked to the unit they'd been using and looked at the lock, standard commercial grade that I could probably pick if I still remembered what Jerome's older brother had taught us when we were teenagers with too much time and too little supervision. It took me 15 minutes and 2 bent paper clips, but eventually the lock clicked and I rolled the door up just enough to slip inside. The unit was mostly empty now, just some plastic sheeting on the floor and oil stains that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd stored vehicle parts here. But in the corner, I found what I was looking for, a cardboard box that had been overlooked or forgotten in their hurry to load the van. Inside were invoices and receipts and handwritten notes in Richard's distinctive scrawl, documentation of sales to buyers with cash and no questions, prices that were 50 cents on the dollar for parts that had been reported as stolen. And, at the very bottom of the box, folded carefully like it was important, was a printed email chain between Richard and someone named Marcus Landry with a Miami address. The emails spelled it all out: the plan to steal high-value recall parts and sell them before the manufacturers could reclaim them, the decision to frame me after I started asking too many questions about Tasha's medical expenses, even the detail about creating fake invoices with my employee ID to establish a pattern of theft. The last email in the chain was dated 2 days before my surgery, and in it, Richard wrote, "The donor situation is perfect timing. He'll be too distracted to notice anything, and if he does figure it out later, we'll already have the paper trail in place. T says he trusts me completely, won't even question why she's asking him to sign the NDA." Reading it made me feel hollowed out, made me understand just how completely I'd been manipulated by people who saw my kindness as a weakness they could exploit. I photographed every page, every email, every handwritten note that showed intent and planning and criminal conspiracy. Then I put everything back exactly how I'd found it, locked the unit behind me, and walked back to my car with evidence that would either save my life or get me killed depending on how smart I was about using it. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every stoplight a chance to second-guess what I'd just done. Every dark stretch of road a reminder that Richard and Tasha weren't going to take this quietly once they realized I had proof of everything. But I wasn't backing down anymore. Wasn't going to let them win just because they'd been clever about setting me up. I had what I needed now. All that was left was deciding how to use it without ending up arrested, or worse, before the truth came out. The smart move would have been to take everything to the police immediately, let them handle it and stay out of the way while justice took its slow mechanical course through the system. But I'd learned enough in the past 2 weeks to know that the police would want more than photos and security footage before they moved against a local business owner with no criminal record. They'd want testimony and witnesses and probably a full investigation that could take months while Richard covered his tracks and I stayed suspended without income or reputation. So instead of going to the police, I did something that would either make me look brilliant or reckless depending on how it turned out. I started mapping out Richard's entire operation, treating it like an engine I was trying to understand before I took it apart. The storage facility was just one piece of a larger system, and I needed to see all the connections before I knew where to apply pressure. I spent 3 days doing nothing but research, tracing the business licenses for Richard's shops, looking up property records and tax filings, following digital trails through public databases that showed how money moved through his various accounts. What I found was a network more complicated than it needed to be. Multiple LLCs and holding companies that all connected back to Richard, but in ways that would take an accountant weeks to unravel. The shell companies had names like Great Lakes Auto Solutions and Midwest Parts Distribution, official-sounding entities that existed mostly on paper and in bank accounts. I traced them through business registration databases and found they all listed the same address, a law office in Southfield that specialized in corporate formations and probably never asked questions about what their clients actually did. Each company had its own tax ID and bank account, perfect for moving money around without creating obvious trails, perfect for someone who wanted to run a legitimate business on the surface while stealing underneath it. But the interesting thing was one particular account I found during my searching, an offshore account with a bank in the Cayman Islands that showed up in a leaked database of corporate registrations. The account was under Tasha's name, opened 6 months ago, right around the time her medical bills would have been mounting, right around the time the thefts from the shop started showing up in the security footage. I screenshot everything and added it to the growing file on my laptop, cross-referencing dates and amounts until I had a timeline that showed exactly when money had been moved and where it had gone. The total was over $200,000, way more than could be explained by selling stolen auto parts even at full price. That's when I realized the parts weren't the main scheme. They were just a bonus. The real money was in the insurance fraud, in filing claims for stolen inventory that Richard had actually sold himself, collecting reimbursement from his insurance company while also getting cash from black market buyers. He'd been running this for at least a year based on the records I found, maybe longer, and the total take was probably close to $500,000 when you added up all the inflated claims and unreported sales. It was sophisticated enough that it might have gone unnoticed forever if he hadn't gotten greedy and decided to frame me for it. The offshore account under Tasha's name was the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that tied her directly to the conspiracy and showed this wasn't just Richard acting alone. I did more digging and found something even better. A second account that had been opened the same day as hers, this one in my name but with a Miami mailing address I'd never lived at. The account had been opened while I was in surgery, had my Social Security number and my forged signature on the paperwork, and had received 3 wire transfers totaling $50,000 in the weeks since then. It was another layer of the frame-up, designed to make it look like I'd been collecting payment for my supposed theft, money I'd supposedly hidden in an offshore account while playing the role of the honest working man. I sat back from my laptop and thought about how elegant it all was, how Richard had built a system that would protect him no matter what happened. If the theft was never discovered, he'd keep stealing and making money. If it was discovered, he'd blame me and point to all the evidence he'd carefully created. And if I somehow proved my innocence, he could claim Tasha had acted alone, that he'd been deceived by his employee's girlfriend just like I had. The only thing he hadn't counted on was me being smart enough to look beyond the obvious evidence, patient enough to gather proof before I made any moves. I printed everything out and organized it into a folder that read like a prosecutor's dream case. Page after page of documented fraud and conspiracy and identity theft. Then I made 3 copies, one for my lawyer, one for my safe deposit box at the bank, and one that I kept with me at all times in case something happened before I could use it. The evidence was solid enough now that even a skeptical prosecutor would have to take it seriously, comprehensive enough that Richard wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it once the authorities started looking. But I still didn't go to the police. Not yet, because I wanted to watch Richard squirm first. Wanted him to know I'd beaten him before I handed him over to the system. Instead, I did something that was probably stupid but felt necessary. I planted a recorder in Richard's office. Not a sophisticated one, just a small digital device I bought at an electronics store for $50, the kind that voice activates and records for up to 20 hours before the memory fills up. I waited until Sunday night when the shop was closed and got in through the side door after disarming the alarm. The alarm code hadn't been changed yet. Another sign that Richard was overconfident, thought he'd won so completely that basic security didn't matter anymore. I placed the recorder under Richard's desk where it wouldn't be visible unless someone was specifically looking for it, taped it to the underside of the desk with enough adhesive that it wouldn't fall, but not so much that I couldn't retrieve it later. Then I left the way I'd come in, locked the door behind me, and drove home feeling like I'd just committed a crime, even though technically I was just gathering evidence of bigger crimes. The recorder would run for almost a full day before I'd need to retrieve it. Plenty of time to catch whatever conversations Richard had with Tasha or his suppliers or anyone else involved in the operation. 3 days later, I went back for the recorder. Same Sunday night timing and same careful entry through the side door. The device was still where I'd left it, and when I played it back in my car, I found exactly what I'd been hoping for. Hours of nothing, just office sounds and phone calls about legitimate business. But then, around the 7-hour mark, I heard Richard's voice clearly followed by Tasha's, both of them in his office after hours discussing something they didn't want anyone else to hear. I turned up the volume and listened as they talked about the cargo van full of parts they'd sold to a buyer in Ohio, about how the money had cleared and been deposited into the offshore accounts, about how much longer they needed to wait before they could safely leave. "Once the money clears, we're gone for good," Richard said, his voice carrying that satisfied tone people get when they think they've gotten away with something. There was the sound of papers shuffling, and then Tasha responded, "So is he." And I heard what might have been laughter, or might have been something colder. They talked for another 10 minutes about logistics and timing, about closing out the offshore accounts and transferring everything to new ones under different names, about the condo in Miami that was waiting for them once they wrapped up loose ends in Detroit. Every word was incriminating, every casual admission another nail in their coffin, and I listened to it all with the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from knowing you're 3 steps ahead of people who think they're the smartest in the room. I made copies of the recording and added it to my evidence file. Everything now organized and cross-referenced and ready to present. The case against them was complete, airtight enough that no lawyer could talk their way out of it, comprehensive enough that prosecutors would be fighting over who got to take it to trial. But I still waited, still held back from making my move, because I wanted one more thing before I destroyed them. I wanted to see them comfortable, wanted to watch them think they'd won, wanted them to feel safe enough to make mistakes. Patience had gotten me this far, and patience would get me to the end. So I settled in and watched and waited for the perfect moment to take everything they'd built and burn it down around them. The break I was waiting for came on a Thursday morning when I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop on Woodward, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching Richard's BMW parked 3 spots down. He'd been inside for 20 minutes meeting with someone I didn't recognize, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he dealt in things more complicated than auto parts. I'd been following Richard's patterns for 2 weeks now, learning his schedule and his habits, figuring out where he felt safe enough to talk openly. The coffee shop was one of those places, neutral territory where he thought no one was paying attention to his conversations. I'd already planted a small recording device under Richard's car during his meeting, magnetic case stuck to the frame near the driver's side where he'd never think to look. It was better than trying to bug his office again, more mobile and harder to detect, and it would capture any conversations he had while driving, which was when people tended to let their guard down. The device was voice-activated and would upload recordings to a cloud server I'd set up using an anonymous email, giving me access to everything without needing to physically retrieve it. The technology was better than anything I could have afforded a year ago, but I'd sold some tools and my old motorcycle to pay for it, figuring my future was worth more than my past possessions. Richard came out of the coffee shop looking pleased with himself, shaking hands with the suit and clapping him on the shoulder in that way businessmen do when they've closed a deal. He got in his car and I watched him pull out, waited 30 seconds and then followed at my usual distance. He drove to the shop first, spent an hour inside doing whatever bosses do when they're not actively running a criminal enterprise, then came out talking on his phone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his expression, relaxed and confident in a way that made me want to smash something. He drove toward downtown and I followed, already knowing from his pattern that he was probably heading to Tasha's apartment. Sure enough, he pulled into the parking structure of the riverfront building where I'd seen him before, the same luxury development that Tasha apparently lived in now despite supposedly being on disability. I couldn't follow him inside, so I parked and waited, pulled up the app on my phone that connected to the recorder under his car. The audio was already uploading, 30 minutes of him driving and talking on his phone about inventory and suppliers and normal business things that didn't matter. I fast-forwarded through it until I heard voices change, until Richard stopped talking to phone calls and started talking to someone in his car. "We need to talk about the timeline." Tasha's voice came through clearly, close enough to the recorder that she must have been sitting in the passenger seat. I heard car doors close and the engine start, Richard pulling out of the parking structure while they talked. He said something about having until the end of the month that the buyer in Chicago was ready for the next shipment but needed better documentation this time. Tasha responded that she could handle the paperwork, that she'd gotten good at forging my signature over the past few months. The casual way she said it, like forgery was just another skill she'd picked up, made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. They drove for maybe 10 minutes while the conversation continued, talking about money and accounts and logistics like they were planning a vacation instead of a crime. Then Richard said something that made my blood freeze, made me understand just how thoroughly they'd thought this through. "Once the money clears, she's gone for good," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost regretful, like he was talking about getting rid of something he'd grown fond of. Tasha was quiet for a moment, and then she responded, her voice flat and cold. "So is he." The words hung in the recording, and I played them back 3 times to make sure I'd heard correctly, to make sure I understood what they meant. She wasn't just talking about me being gone from their lives or gone from the shop. She was talking about me being gone in a more permanent way. I thought about the threatening text I'd received, about the photo of me unconscious in the hospital, about how easy it would be to make someone disappear if you had enough money and enough motivation. They'd already stolen from me and framed me and destroyed my reputation. Why wouldn't they go further if they thought I was getting too close to the truth? I sat in my car listening to the rest of the recording while my mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. They talked about cleanup and loose ends, about making sure nothing could be traced back to them once they left Detroit. Richard mentioned having someone who could handle problems, if necessary, someone discreet who'd done work for him before. Tasha asked if he was sure this person could be trusted, and Richard laughed, said everyone could be trusted if you paid them enough. The conversation lasted another 5 minutes and then stopped, probably when they arrived at wherever they were going. I saved the recording and made backup copies immediately, sent it to 3 different email addresses, and uploaded it to 2 different cloud services. This wasn't just evidence of theft anymore. This was conspiracy to commit murder, or at minimum conspiracy to commit serious harm. The joke about my kidney earlier suddenly didn't seem like a joke at all. Suddenly seemed like part of a plan that had started months ago and that I'd walked into like someone too trusting to see the trap closing around them. I thought about going to the police right then, showing them everything and letting them handle it before things got worse. But something held me back, some part of me that needed to see this through on my own terms. I drove to Jerome's house instead and played him the recording, watched his face change as he heard the same threats I'd heard. When it finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said what I already knew, that this had moved beyond civil fraud into territory where people got killed. He wanted me to go to the police immediately, wanted me to get protective custody, or at minimum stop following Richard around like I was invincible. But I told him I needed just a little more time, needed to get enough evidence that the police couldn't ignore it and prosecutors couldn't refuse to press charges. He didn't like it, but he understood, told me to be careful and to check in every day so he'd know I was alive. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went back through everything I'd collected, organized it all into a timeline that showed the progression from simple theft to elaborate frame-up to something that looked a lot like planning a murder. The evidence was overwhelming now. Dozens of recordings and documents and photos that told a story no defense attorney could talk their way out of. All I needed was one more piece, something that would take what I had from suggestive to absolutely conclusive, something that would make this case not just winnable, but inevitable. The answer came to me around 3 a.m. when I was half asleep on my couch with my laptop still open. I needed to catch them in the act, needed footage or recording of them actually doing something illegal that couldn't be explained away. The storage facility in Taylor was the answer, the place where they kept the stolen parts before selling them, the location that tied everything together. If I could document them selling parts from that unit, could capture them accepting payment and loading merchandise into a buyer's vehicle, then I'd have everything needed to destroy them completely. It was dangerous and probably stupid, but it was also the last piece I needed, so I started planning how to get it without getting caught or killed in the process. I set up surveillance at the storage facility on a Saturday afternoon, parking my car in a lot across the street where I had a clear view of the unit Richard had been using. I'd brought binoculars and my phone fully charged, ready to document whatever happened. The wait was longer than I expected. 3 hours of watching nothing until finally Richard's BMW pulled up, followed by an unfamiliar pickup truck with Ohio plates. 2 men got out of the truck, both wearing work clothes and looking around nervously like they knew they were doing something wrong. Richard opened the storage unit and I started recording on my phone, zooming in as far as the camera would allow. They worked quickly, loading boxes from the unit into the truck bed while Richard stood by checking items off on a clipboard. I could see him talking to the buyers, probably explaining what they were getting or negotiating final prices. The transaction took maybe 20 minutes total, and then I watched one of the men hand Richard an envelope, thick enough that it had to contain cash, enough cash that this wasn't a small-time operation. They shook hands, and the truck pulled away, Richard locking the unit behind them and driving off in his BMW looking satisfied. I had everything on video. Clear footage of the sale and the cash exchange and the stolen parts being loaded into a vehicle. It was exactly what I needed, but I knew it still wasn't enough to just hand over to police, knew I needed to make this public in a way that would force authorities to act whether they wanted to or not. So I did something that my younger self would never have considered. I reached out to a local journalist who'd written about fraud cases before, a woman named Andrea Miller, who worked for a Detroit news website and had a reputation for going after powerful people who thought they were untouchable. I contacted Andrea through an encrypted email service, told her I had evidence of a major fraud case involving a local business and that I wanted to share it anonymously. She wrote back within an hour asking for details, and I sent her a sample, just enough of the evidence to prove I was serious without giving away everything I had. We went back and forth for a day, her asking questions and me providing carefully edited answers, until finally she agreed to meet me at a public library branch in Warren where we could talk without being overheard. I showed up 30 minutes early and watched the entrance, making sure she came alone and that no one was following her. Andrea turned out to be younger than I expected, maybe 35 with sharp eyes and the kind of skeptical expression journalists develop after years of people lying to them. I gave her copies of everything, the security footage and the recordings and the financial documents and the photos from the storage facility, hundreds of pages of evidence that spelled out the entire conspiracy. She went through it methodically, asking questions and taking notes and occasionally stopping to look at me like she was trying to figure out if I was credible or crazy. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said this was bigger than she'd expected, that if even half of it was true, it would blow up into a major story. Why come to me instead of going to the police? She asked, and I told her the truth, that I didn't trust the system to move fast enough before Richard and Tasha disappeared, that I needed public pressure to force authorities to act. She understood that, told me she'd need a few days to verify the evidence and contact sources to make sure everything was solid before she published anything. I told her to be careful, told her these weren't people who'd take kindly to being exposed, but she just smiled and said she'd been threatened by better criminals than Richard. We agreed she'd run the story as soon as she had independent confirmation of the key facts, probably within a week if things went smoothly. I left the library feeling lighter than I had in weeks, like I'd finally set something in motion that couldn't be stopped or controlled by Richard and Tasha. The next few days were tense, waiting for Andrea to finish her investigation and wondering if Richard would figure out what was coming before it hit. I stopped following him and stayed home mostly, kept my head down and tried to look like someone who'd given up and moved on. My phone kept buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably debt collectors or lawyers or people who wanted to talk about the accusations against me, but I ignored them all and focused on preparing for what came next. The story dropped on a Wednesday morning. Front page of the Detroit news website with Andrea's byline and a headline that read, "Local auto shop owner accused of elaborate fraud scheme." The article laid out everything, the thefts and the frame-up and the offshore accounts, all of it documented with evidence that made denial impossible. Andrea had done excellent work, tracking down additional victims and finding suppliers who confirmed they'd dealt with Richard's shell companies, building a case that went beyond what I'd given her. Within hours, the story had been picked up by other news outlets, local TV stations sending reporters to the shop and to Richard's house, social media exploding with commentary and outrage. I watched it all from my apartment, scrolling through news sites and social media posts while my phone continued buzzing with calls. The shop had closed immediately, Richard's employees showing up to find the doors locked and a notice posted about an ongoing investigation. Dante texted me asking if I'd seen the news and if I knew anything about it, and I texted back that I was just as surprised as anyone. By late afternoon, the police had announced they were opening a criminal investigation, that they were working with federal authorities because the fraud crossed state lines and involved offshore banking. Everything was happening faster than I'd expected, the system finally moving the way it was supposed to when there was too much public attention to ignore. That evening, the news reported that authorities had raided Richard's home and his shop, that they'd seized computers and documents and were interviewing witnesses. What they didn't report yet was that Tasha's car had been found abandoned by the docks, doors unlocked and keys still in the ignition like she'd left in a hurry or like someone had staged it to look that way. I heard about it from Jerome, who heard it from someone in the prosecutor's office, and the detail made my stomach turn because I couldn't tell if she'd run or if something worse had happened. Either way, she was gone, disappeared just like they'd been planning, except on someone else's timeline instead of their own. Tasha showed up at my apartment 2 days after the story broke, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd handed me legal documents and threatened my future. Her makeup was smudged and running, her hands shaking so badly she could barely knock on my door, her expensive clothes wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them or hadn't slept at all. I saw her through the peephole, and my first instinct was to not answer, to let her stand there until she gave up and left. But curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was something darker than curiosity, some need to hear what excuse she'd try to offer for everything she'd done. I opened the door but didn't invite her in, just stood there blocking the entrance while she looked up at me with red eyes that might have been from crying or might have been from something else. She started talking immediately, words tumbling out in a rush about how she was sorry and how things had gotten out of control and how she needed my help. The story she told was one I'd heard before in different forms. The classic narrative of the person who was just following orders or just trying to survive or just caught up in something they didn't fully understand. She claimed Richard had manipulated her, threatened her, promised her things that turned out to be lies designed to keep her compliant. "You have to help me get out before Richard kills me," she said, and her voice broke on the last word like she actually believed it, like she thought I'd forgotten the recording where she'd agreed I should be gone too. I let her talk for another minute, watched her performance with the kind of detached interest you might have watching a movie you'd already seen, knowing how it ended and just waiting to see if the actor would commit to the role. She reached out like she might touch my arm, and I stepped back, kept the doorway between us like a physical barrier she couldn't cross. "Come inside," I finally said, and the relief that crossed her face was almost enough to make me feel something like pity. Almost, but not quite. She followed me into my living room, and I gestured to the couch where she'd sat dozens of times before when this place had been ours together. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, took my time with it while she sat alone with her thoughts and whatever fear was driving her to come here. When I came back, I handed her a cup and sat across from her in the chair I'd refinished back when we still had a future, back when I thought saving her life would matter. "Where's Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and my face blank, giving her nothing to read or react to. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup like she needed the warmth, stared into it while she talked about how Richard had left town already, how he'd taken most of the money from the offshore accounts and disappeared before the police could arrest him. She claimed she hadn't known about his plans to leave her behind, that she'd only found out when she went to the condo in Miami and discovered he'd never actually put her name on the lease. It was a good story, the kind that might have made me angry on her behalf if I hadn't heard her voice on the recording talking about making sure I was gone. I let her finish her story, and then I stood up, walked to my desk, and picked up a small recording device I'd left sitting there specifically for this moment. I held it up so she could see it, watched understanding dawn on her face as she realized what it meant. Her expression shifted from desperate to calculating in less than a second, the mask dropping away to reveal something colder underneath. I pressed play, and her own voice filled my living room, the recording from Richard's car where she'd agreed that I should be gone, where she'd talked about cleanup and loose ends like I was a problem that needed solving. "That entire conversation you just had with Richard?" I said, setting the recorder down between us on the coffee table. "I have it. All of it. Every word about framing me, every plan to disappear, every casual discussion about making sure I couldn't talk." I watched her face cycle through emotions, denial to anger to fear, and back again, trying to find the right response to a situation she clearly hadn't anticipated. She set down her coffee cup with shaking hands, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage this or if she was completely finished. She tried one more approach, leaning forward with tears starting again, telling me she'd been scared and that Richard had forced her to say those things, that she'd never actually meant any of it. But the performance was weaker now, unconvincing even to her as she spoke. I just sat there and watched her realize that nothing she said would change what I knew. Nothing she could do would make me forget what she'd done. After a few minutes, she went quiet, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and looked at me with something that might have been respect or might have been hatred, hard to tell which. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice flat and empty of the desperation she'd been performing earlier. It was the first honest thing she'd said since showing up at my door, the first moment where she'd stopped pretending and just acknowledged the reality of her situation. I thought about that question, about what I actually wanted from this woman who I'd loved enough to give a kidney to, who'd loved me so little she'd helped frame me for crimes I didn't commit. The answer should have been complicated, but it wasn't. It was actually simple enough to say in one sentence. "I want you to tell the truth," I said. "Not to me. I already know the truth. To the police, to the prosecutors, to everyone who needs to hear it so Richard can't walk away from this." She laughed at that, a bitter sound that held no humor at all, and shook her head like I'd asked for something impossible. She told me Richard would kill her if she testified against him, that he had connections and money and ways of reaching people even from wherever he was hiding. I believed her about that, believed Richard was dangerous in ways I'd underestimated, but I also didn't care anymore about protecting her from consequences she'd helped create. "Then you should have thought about that before you helped him destroy my life," I said, and my voice came out colder than I intended, colder than I'd ever heard myself sound. "You took my kidney and used it to fund your escape while you set me up to take the fall for your crimes. You don't get to ask me for protection now." She stared at me for a long moment, and then she stood up, walked to my window and looked out at the street below like she was checking to see if anyone was waiting for her. When she turned back, her face had settled into resignation, the look of someone who'd finally run out of moves. "If I cooperate, if I tell them everything, what happens to me?" she asked, and I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know and didn't particularly care. She'd face charges for her role in the conspiracy, probably do time depending on how good her lawyer was and how much the prosecutors wanted her testimony against Richard. But she'd be alive and she'd have my kidney still functioning inside her, which was more than she deserved, and more than I'd have if she'd gotten her way. She nodded slowly like she was accepting a sentence that had already been passed, then asked if she could use my bathroom before she left. I waited while she was gone, listened to the water run, and wondered if she was actually considering what I'd said or just buying time to figure out another angle. When she came back out, she looked marginally more composed, makeup fixed and hair pushed back, armor rebuilt enough to face whatever came next. She walked to my door and stopped with her hand on the knob, turned back to look at me one more time. I thought she might apologize or make one more attempt to manipulate me, but instead she just asked a question that I hadn't expected. "Did you ever really love me?" she asked, and the vulnerability in her voice sounded genuine for the first time since she'd arrived. I thought about lying, about telling her what she wanted to hear or what would hurt her most, but in the end, I just told her the truth. "I loved who I thought you were," I said. "The person you actually are? I don't know if anyone could love that." She flinched like I'd hit her, and then she opened the door and walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into nothing. I sat in my living room for a long time after she left, the recording device still sitting on my coffee table where I'd placed it. The whole encounter felt surreal, like watching a play where I knew all the lines but still had to perform them anyway. I called Jerome and told him what happened. Told him Tasha had shown up and that I'd pushed her toward cooperation without making any actual deals or promises. He said I'd done the right thing, that anything else would have complicated my position or made me look like I was obstructing justice. We talked for a few more minutes and then I hung up and went back to waiting, back to watching everything I'd set in motion continue to unfold. The FBI arrested Richard 3 days later in a hotel room outside Nashville, picked him up before dawn with enough agents that he couldn't run or fight or talk his way out of it. The news showed footage of him being walked out in handcuffs, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his expression shocked like he couldn't believe this was happening to him. The charges were extensive, everything from wire fraud to conspiracy to identity theft, federal crimes that carried serious prison time even for first-time offenders. The prosecutor held a press conference that afternoon and laid out the case in detail, mentioned multiple victims and hundreds of thousands in losses, painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Tasha had turned herself in the day after visiting my apartment, walked into a police station with a lawyer and offered to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. The news reported she'd provided detailed testimony about the entire operation, confirmed everything the evidence already showed, and added details that only an insider would know. Her cooperation was crucial for building the case against Richard, giving prosecutors the kind of direct testimony that made trials almost unnecessary. The lawyer she'd hired was court-appointed, which meant she'd run out of money or never had as much as she'd pretended. Another lie in a relationship that had been built on lies from the start. My own vindication came through official channels a week later. A letter from Richard's attorney notifying me that all accusations had been dropped and that I was welcome to return to work if I chose. The letter was carefully worded to avoid admitting any wrongdoing, phrased like they were doing me a favor rather than correcting a massive injustice. I read it once and then threw it away because I had no intention of ever working for anyone connected to Richard again. No interest in walking back into a place where I'd been betrayed so thoroughly. Instead, I filed a lawsuit, both civil and criminal complaints against Richard's business and against him personally, seeking damages for lost wages and emotional distress and defamation. The media coverage was intense for about 2 weeks. My name mentioned in every article as the mechanic who'd been framed after donating a kidney to his girlfriend. Reporters called constantly asking for interviews and comment, wanting me to tell my story on camera or for their podcasts or their investigative pieces. I turned down most of them but agreed to talk to Andrea, the journalist who'd broken the initial story, figuring I owed her at least that much for taking the risk of publishing what I'd given her. We met at the same library where we'd first talked, and I gave her the full story. Everything from the donation to the discovery to the recordings I'd made, all of it on the record now that the legal case was solid. Her follow-up article was longer and more personal than the first one, included details about my recovery from surgery and the betrayal I'd felt when Tasha handed me that document. The piece went viral in a way I hadn't anticipated, shared across social media and picked up by national news outlets who saw it as a compelling human interest story. Suddenly, I was getting messages from strangers telling me I was brave or inspiring, people sharing their own stories of betrayal and asking how I'd found the strength to fight back. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable, but also validating in a way I hadn't expected, proof that what had happened to me mattered to people beyond just my immediate circle. The trial happened faster than trials usually do, pushed through the system by prosecutors who wanted the conviction and by Richard's lawyer who knew his client had no real defense. I had to testify, spent 3 hours on the stand walking through the timeline and explaining the evidence I'd gathered. Richard's attorney tried to make me look vindictive or unstable, suggested I'd fabricated evidence because I was angry about the breakup. But the recordings and the security footage and Tasha's testimony made those arguments fall apart. The jury deliberated for less than a day before coming back with guilty verdicts on all major charges, and I watched Richard's face as they read each one, watched him realize his life was effectively over. Tasha's sentencing came a month later, a plea deal that gave her 5 years with possibility of parole after 3 in exchange for her cooperation. The judge was harsh during sentencing, talked about the breach of trust and the exploitation of someone's medical sacrifice, made it clear that her sentence would have been much longer without the plea agreement. I didn't attend her sentencing because I had no desire to see her again, no interest in whatever remorse she might perform for the judge and the court. Jerome went and texted me updates, told me she'd cried and apologized and said she regretted everything, the same performance she'd given in my living room that hadn't moved me then and didn't move me now. A reporter caught Tasha outside the courthouse after sentencing, asked her on live television if she'd ever really loved me. I watched the clip later on social media, saw her pause and look directly at the camera before answering. "Which one?" she said, and the reporter looked confused, asked her to clarify what she meant. But Tasha just shook her head and walked away, leaving that question hanging in the air like a final insult. One last way of making sure everyone knew she'd played both of us. The clip got thousands of views and comments, people analyzing what she'd meant and whether it made her more or less sympathetic, but I just closed the video and moved on because her answer didn't matter anymore. Richard got 22 years, a sentence harsh enough that he'd be in his 60s before he was eligible for parole. The judge cited the sophistication of the fraud and the attempt to frame an innocent person as aggravating factors, made it clear this wasn't just about theft, but about the systematic destruction of someone's life for personal gain. I watched that sentencing on a live stream from my apartment, saw Richard's face as they took him away in handcuffs, saw the reality settle over him that he'd lost everything. Part of me felt satisfaction at that, but mostly I just felt tired, worn out from months of fighting and investigating and testifying, ready to be done with all of it. The lawsuit settled 2 months after the criminal trial ended, Richard's insurance company paying out rather than fighting a case they knew they'd lose. The settlement was substantial, enough to cover my medical bills and my lost wages and then some, enough to give me options I hadn't had before. The money hit my account on a Tuesday morning, and I stared at the balance for a long time, thinking about how strange it was that numbers on a screen could represent everything I'd lost and fought to get back. It wasn't really about the money, though, never had been. It was about proving that what they'd done to me wasn't acceptable, that people couldn't just use you up and throw you away without consequences. I used part of the settlement money to start my own shop, a small operation in Hamtramck where rent was cheaper and the community actually needed reliable mechanics who wouldn't rip them off. I hired Tommy first, the young apprentice from Richard's shop who'd been let go when the business collapsed, gave him a chance to learn properly without the corruption that had infected his previous training. Dante came on board next, then Big Marcus, until I had a team of people I actually trusted, working in a place where honesty meant something. We didn't get rich, but we made enough to pay rent and keep food on the table, built a reputation for fair prices and quality work that brought customers back. The local news did a follow-up story 6 months after the trial, one of those "Where Are They Now" pieces that tracked what had happened to everyone involved. They filmed at my shop while I was working on a transmission, interviewed me about the business and about moving forward after everything that had happened. I kept my answers short and focused on the work, talked about the satisfaction of building something honest and the loyalty of customers who appreciated being treated fairly. The reporter asked if I'd forgiven Tasha and Richard, and I told them forgiveness wasn't really the point, that I'd moved past anger into something more productive, focused on my own future rather than their punishment. Business picked up after that story aired, people coming in specifically because they'd heard about what happened and wanted to support someone who'd been through it. Some of them had their own stories of being cheated or framed or used, found something in my experience that resonated with their own struggles. I listened when they wanted to talk and worked on their cars when they didn't, treated everyone the way I wished I'd been treated back when I was too trusting to see manipulation coming. The shop became more than just a business. It became proof that you could survive betrayal and build something meaningful from the wreckage. I was closing up one evening about 8 months after opening when I saw Tasha's car pull into the lot, the same silver Honda I'd helped her pick out back when we were different people. My first instinct was to lock the door and pretend I hadn't seen her, but curiosity won out again just like it had the last time she'd shown up unexpectedly. She got out of the car, slowly, looked around the shop with an expression I couldn't quite read, walked toward me with her hands in her jacket pockets. She looked different than she had at my apartment, healthier but also harder somehow, like prison had changed her in ways that weren't immediately visible. "Nice place," she said when she got close enough to talk without shouting. I nodded, but didn't say anything, just waited to hear why she was here and what she possibly thought I wanted to hear from her. She pulled a small envelope from her pocket and held it out to me, her hand steady in a way it hadn't been last time we'd seen each other. I took the envelope and opened it, found a check inside made out to me for exactly $1. The memo line said, "For your kidney," in her handwriting. Neat letters that showed careful consideration rather than angry scrawling. I looked at the check and then at her, trying to figure out if this was meant to be an insult or an apology or something else entirely. She met my eyes without flinching and told me she'd been thinking about what she owed me, about how you couldn't really put a price on saving someone's life, but that the gesture mattered anyway. The dollar was symbolic, she said, An acknowledgement that she knew what I'd given and that no amount of money would ever actually pay for it. I held the check for a moment and then I started laughing. Couldn't help myself because the absurdity of it was overwhelming. This woman who'd helped steal from me and frame me and threaten my life now offering me $1 like it meant something. "Keep it," I said, handing the check back to her still folded in the envelope. "You'll need it for the bus." The insult landed cleanly, and I saw her face flush with anger or embarrassment or maybe both. Behind me, I heard noise from inside the shop. Tommy and Dante watching through the window, probably having been watching the whole interaction. I heard them laugh and saw Tasha's expression harden. Watched her realize that this moment was about more than just us, that there were witnesses to her humiliation who'd remember this and probably talk about it. She put the envelope back in her pocket and turned to leave. Got maybe 3 steps before stopping and looking back at me one more time. "I really am sorry," she said, and her voice carried something that might have been genuine regret underneath all the other complicated emotions. I shrugged because sorry didn't really change anything, didn't undo the damage or restore what had been lost, was just a word people said when they wanted to feel better about themselves. She seemed to understand that, nodded slowly and got back in her car, drove away without looking back again. I went back inside where Tommy and Dante were still watching through the window, both of them grinning like they'd just witnessed something important. "What was that about?" Tommy asked, and I told him it was just someone from my past trying to settle a debt that couldn't be settled. Dante clapped me on the shoulder and said something about moving on and not looking back, wisdom that felt earned given everything he'd seen happen at Richard's shop. We finished closing up and I locked the door behind us, walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in months, like that interaction had closed something that had been left open too long. The next morning, I got a call from a producer at a national talk show, one of those daytime programs that did human interest stories and interviews with people who'd overcome adversity. They wanted me to come on and tell my story, said they'd been following the case since it broke and thought it would resonate with their audience. My first instinct was to refuse because I'd never been comfortable with attention, never wanted to be the kind of person who made a career out of their trauma. But something made me say yes, made me think that maybe telling the story one more time in a bigger venue would matter to someone who needed to hear it. The taping was scheduled for 2 weeks later in New York, expenses paid, and a small appearance fee that wouldn't change my life but would cover a month's rent on the shop. I flew out on a Tuesday morning and spent the day before taping with producers who wanted to know every detail, who crafted questions designed to get emotional responses without being exploitative. The host was someone I'd seen on TV before, warm and professional, made me feel comfortable enough that when the cameras started rolling, I forgot to be nervous. I told the story the way I'd lived it, honest and direct without exaggeration. Let the facts speak for themselves because the facts were damning enough. The interview aired on a Thursday, and within hours my phone was blowing up with messages and calls from people who'd seen it. Friends I hadn't talked to in years reached out to say they'd been inspired. Strangers sent emails telling me I'd helped them understand their own situations better. Opportunities started appearing that I'd never imagined back when I was just a mechanic trying to survive. The shop's phone rang constantly with new customers who'd heard about me through the show, people willing to drive across the city because they trusted someone who'd proven they couldn't be broken or bought. One of the calls came from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to do a longer piece about the case, interviews with everyone involved, and a deep dive into how someone could be so thoroughly betrayed by people they trusted. I agreed to participate but set conditions. Insisted that the focus be on the systematic problems rather than just my personal story, wanted people to understand how easily the innocent could be framed when institutions failed to protect them. The filming process took months and was more exhausting than I'd expected, reliving everything multiple times for different camera angles and interview settings, but the final product was something I could be proud of. The documentary premiered at a film festival and won an award for social impact journalism. Got picked up by a streaming service, and suddenly my story was reaching millions of people instead of just thousands. The attention was overwhelming in ways both good and bad. Opportunities mixed with invasion of privacy, support mixed with people who wanted to profit from my experience. I had to hire someone to manage interview requests and appearance offers, found myself turning down more opportunities than I accepted because some of them felt exploitative or sensational in ways that made me uncomfortable. Through it all, I kept working at the shop, kept showing up every day to do the same job I'd been doing before any of this happened. That routine kept me grounded when everything else felt chaotic and unpredictable, reminded me that I was still fundamentally the same person even if the world saw me differently now. Tommy had gotten good enough that I trusted him with complex jobs. Dante had taken on more management responsibilities, and we'd hired 3 more mechanics to handle the increased business. The shop was thriving in ways I'd never imagined when I first signed the lease, success built on nothing more complicated than honesty and skill and treating people fairly. One afternoon, I was under a car when I heard someone ask for me specifically, a voice I didn't recognize asking if Derek was available. I rolled out from under the vehicle and saw a young man, maybe 22 or 23, nervous energy in the way he stood and looked around the shop. He introduced himself as Marcus, said he'd seen the documentary and wanted to ask my advice about a situation he was in at his own job. I invited him into my office and listened while he told me about a boss who was manipulating timesheets, co-workers who were afraid to speak up, a system that seemed designed to protect the powerful while punishing anyone who questioned things. I gave him what advice I could, told him to document everything and find allies and be prepared for retaliation, but to fight anyway if the cause was worth it. He thanked me and left looking more determined than he had when he arrived, and I sat in my office thinking about how strange it was to be someone other people came to for guidance. That conversation repeated itself over the following months. Different people with different problems, but all of them looking for proof that standing up to injustice was possible, that the system could work if you pushed hard enough and refused to back down. The recognition I got wasn't always comfortable, but I learned to use it in ways that felt meaningful. I spoke at community centers and colleges about worker rights and documentation, taught people how to protect themselves from the kind of fraud and manipulation I'd experienced. Every talk I gave felt like turning my experience into something useful, transforming trauma into education and anger into advocacy. It wasn't revenge exactly, but it was a different kind of justice, the kind that came from making sure what happened to me would be harder for someone to do to the next person. I was giving one of those talks at a community college when I saw someone in the back row who looked familiar. Took me a minute to recognize Jerome's cousin who'd been at that first meeting with the prosecutor. After the talk, she came up and introduced herself properly as Lisa, said she'd followed the case and was impressed by how I'd handled everything. We talked for a while about the legal system and its failures, about how cases like mine only got attention when someone fought hard enough to make noise that couldn't be ignored. She gave me her card and told me to call if I ever needed legal help, that she'd be happy to work with someone who understood how important evidence and preparation were. That night, I drove home thinking about how different my life looked now compared to a year ago, how the person I'd been back then wouldn't recognize the person I'd become. I'd lost a girlfriend and a job and part of an organ, but I'd gained something more valuable in return, something that felt like dignity or self-respect, or maybe just the knowledge that I could survive the worst thing I'd experienced and come out stronger. The scar on my side still pulled sometimes when I moved wrong, physical reminder of what I'd given and what had been taken. But it didn't hurt the way it used to, had settled into being just part of my body instead of a wound that needed attention. My phone buzzed with a new message and I glanced at it while stopped at a light. Saw it was from an unknown number with a New York area code. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it, made me check just in case it was important. The message was short and professional, an offer from a major network to do a multi-part series about fraud and betrayal cases, wanted me to host or co-host because they thought my perspective and experience would resonate with viewers. The attached contract mentioned numbers that made me blink and read twice, compensation that would change my life if I accepted it. I sat at that light thinking about the offer, about whether I wanted to turn my experience into a career or whether I wanted to keep it separate from my day-to-day life. The light changed and someone honked behind me and I drove on without responding to the message, tucked it away to think about later when I had time to consider what kind of future I actually wanted. For now, I had a shop to run and mechanics to pay and customers who trusted me to fix their cars honestly, and that felt like enough. Felt like the kind of success that mattered more than anything a television contract could offer. The decision about the television offer took me 3 weeks to make. 3 weeks of weighing what I wanted against what was being offered. In the end, I turned it down. Told them I appreciated the opportunity, but that I'd rather focus on building something lasting rather than becoming someone whose identity was defined by their worst experience. They were disappointed, but understanding. Said the door would stay open if I changed my mind. Moved on to find someone else who wanted what I didn't. That choice felt right in a way that was hard to explain, like I was choosing my own path instead of following one that had been laid out by circumstances. The shop continued to grow, and I started thinking about expansion, maybe opening a second location or starting a training program for young mechanics who wanted to learn the trade properly. Tommy was ready to take on more responsibility, and Dante had been talking about wanting to teach, so the pieces were there if I wanted to build something bigger. I spent evenings sketching out business plans and running numbers, figuring out if expansion was actually viable or just an ego-driven fantasy that would overextend my resources. The math worked if I was careful, and the demand seemed to be there, so I started seriously planning for what came next. One of the national talk shows reached out again about 6 months after I'd turned down the television offer, this time just asking for a one-time interview as part of a special about people who'd overcome betrayal and rebuilt their lives. The scope felt manageable, and the message aligned with what I actually cared about, so I agreed and flew to New York for the taping. The host was thoughtful and well-prepared, asked questions that focused on recovery and resilience rather than just rehashing the trauma, gave me space to talk about the shop and the community I'd built and the lessons I'd learned from everything that happened. During the interview, she asked the question I'd been anticipating since agreeing to appear, asked if I regretted donating my kidney knowing everything that came after. The answer came easily because I'd thought about it countless times over the past year, worked through the anger and the betrayal until I'd reached something that felt like truth. No, I told her, and I could see surprise in her expression, could feel the audience shift in their seats. I don't regret it because that decision showed me who I was, showed me I was someone who'd do the right thing even when it was hard. What came after showed me who they were, and that's not something I can control or take responsibility for. I kept talking, momentum carrying me through words I'd never said out loud before, but had been thinking for months. Tasha needed a kidney, and I gave her one because that's what you do when someone you love is dying. What she chose to do with that gift, how she chose to treat me after, that's on her, not on me. I learned who deserved my trust and who didn't, learned to protect myself without becoming cynical or closed off, learned that being kind doesn't make you weak as long as you're also smart about it. So, no, I don't regret saving her life. I just learned who deserved it. The studio was quiet when I finished, and I could see people in the audience crying. The host visibly moved in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed. We talked for a few more minutes about the future and about healing, about how you move forward after betrayal without letting it define you. When the interview ended, I felt lighter, like I'd said something I'd needed to say for a long time, like I'd finally put words to feelings that had been tangled up inside me since this whole thing started. The host thanked me, and the audience gave me a standing ovation that felt both humbling and overwhelming. Recognition that what I'd survived mattered to people beyond just me. The episode aired 2 weeks later, and the response was bigger than anything that had come before. Social media flooded with people sharing my words and talking about their own experiences with betrayal and recovery. My quote about learning who deserved it became something people repeated and shared, turned into graphics and posts that spread across platforms I didn't even use. The attention was intense, but this time I was ready for it, had learned from previous experiences how to manage boundaries and protect my peace while still engaging with people who genuinely wanted to connect. I used the momentum from that interview to launch the training program I'd been planning, a formal apprenticeship that would take young people interested in mechanics and teach them properly without exploitation or corner cutting. The program started small, just 3 apprentices working alongside my existing team, but the model was solid and the interest was overwhelming. Applications came in from across the state. Young people who wanted to learn a trade in an environment where honesty and skill were valued over profit and shortcuts. I read through every application personally, chose the kids who reminded me of myself at that age, hungry and loyal and wanting to build something meaningful. Months passed and seasons changed, and gradually the sharp edges of what had happened dulled into something I could live with more comfortably. I still thought about Tasha sometimes, wondered how she was doing in prison and whether she'd actually changed or just learned to be more careful about who she manipulated. I heard through mutual friends that she was taking classes and working in the prison library, information that made me feel nothing much at all beyond a mild curiosity about someone who used to matter but didn't anymore. Richard I never thought about except when I saw headlines about white-collar criminals getting lenient sentences, brief flashes of anger that he was serving real time while others in his position walked away clean. The second location opened in the spring, a bigger facility in Dearborn with space for more bays and a dedicated training area for the apprenticeship program. The expansion was risky and expensive, but it felt right, felt like building something that would last beyond me and my story. I hired more mechanics and more apprentices, created jobs in a community that needed them, built a reputation that extended beyond just fixing cars to becoming a place where people knew they'd be treated fairly. The success wasn't about revenge anymore, and wasn't really about justice either. It was about creating something good from materials that had seemed worthless when I'd started. I was at the new location one afternoon when a familiar car pulled into the lot, Jerome's old sedan that he refused to replace despite everyone telling him he should. He came into the office grinning and holding a folder, told me he had something I'd want to see. Inside were newspaper clippings and printouts about Richard's appeal being denied, about how he'd lost his final chance to reduce his sentence or get released early. The articles mentioned me briefly, referenced the severity of what he'd done, and the judge's statement that his crimes represented a betrayal of trust that warranted every year of his sentence. Jerome and I talked for an hour about everything that had happened, about how far I'd come from that day when I'd woken up from surgery thinking I'd saved someone I loved. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled things, said most people would have either given up or gotten violent, or let the anger consume them until there was nothing left but bitterness. I told him I'd had good people around me, him included, who'd kept me focused when rage would have felt easier than strategy. We both understood that luck had played a role, too. That things could have gone differently if Richard had been smarter, or if the evidence hadn't been there when I needed it. As Jerome left, I stood outside the shop watching the sun set over the city, watched mechanics working in the bays and apprentices learning under their guidance, watched customers picking up vehicles that had been repaired honestly and completely. This was what mattered now, this tangible proof that you could survive betrayal and build something meaningful from the wreckage, that being kind didn't make you weak as long as you stayed smart about who deserved that kindness. The scar on my side pulled slightly when I stretched, but I barely noticed anymore, had integrated it so completely into who I was that it felt like it had always been there. My phone buzzed with notifications from the interview still circulating online, messages from people saying my story had helped them or inspired them, or given them courage to face their own battles. I read a few and then put my phone away because while the recognition was nice, it wasn't why I'd fought back, wasn't the point of any of this. The point was standing here outside my shop watching something I'd built from nothing, knowing I'd done it honestly and that no one could take it away because I'd earned it through work and integrity instead of theft and manipulation. I walked back inside to help close up, joined my team in the routine tasks that ended each day, felt the satisfaction of honest work completed and bills paid and customers satisfied. This was freedom, I realized. This ability to choose my own path and build my own future without being controlled by what had been taken or what had been lost. Tasha had my kidney, and Richard had years in prison, and I had this, a business and a team and a community and proof that survival wasn't enough, that you could thrive after the worst thing happened if you refused to let it break you. The last customer left, and I locked the doors, set the alarm, and walked to my car in the empty lot. Detroit spread out around me in the evening light, the city where I'd been born and betrayed and rebuilt, where I'd learned the hardest lessons and found the strength I didn't know I had. Tomorrow, I'd come back and do it again, work on cars and teach apprentices and build something that mattered, and the day after that, and the day after that, until this shop and this life felt as natural as breathing. That was the real revenge, I thought as I drove home through familiar streets, not destroying my enemies but becoming someone they could never touch again, someone who'd learned from their cruelty and used it to build immunity instead of letting it build walls. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Derek's place? Leave your comment like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.